Can you give us some clarification on whether the orders that were issued apply to specifically Los Angeles, to California generally, or is this a nationwide order?
The orders that have been issued, which are publicly available and known, relate to an ongoing situation in Los Angeles, which could expand to other places. But it's quite easy to point out that there has been an invasion of 21 million illegals in our country under the previous administration.
So
this administration was elected to get a hold of that.
Yeah, can we just
and
take
when
turns?
you have
Yeah.
ICE officers being attacked with concrete blocks,
Secretary,
they should be allowed to do their job.
Secretary, I'd really like to not try to create a viral moment for either of us. I'm actually trying to understand kind of the scope of this order.
Today we're diving into a tense Senate exchange that raises big questions about power, process, and the rule of law. Senators pressed senior officials about emergency orders tied to law enforcement operations in Los Angeles. Orders that, according to testimony, could be scaled or applied more broadly. Was the intent to localize a response to an LA situation, or did the administration potentially create a playbook to surge troops, Guard, or Marines anywhere in the country? There are three core axes we'll follow. First, the scope of the written orders and whether they specify place or permit nationwide action. Second, the legal pathway, what statutes or authorities actually allow mobilization. And third, the diplomatic and procedural chain, who was consulted and what role, if any, foreign actors like Qatar played. I'll walk you through the key exchanges, point out what's documented versus what's asserted, and then we'll host a structured debate with two voices, one arguing necessity and surge readiness, the other warning about constitutional risks and the need for congressional oversight. Let's get into it.
Secretary, thank you for being here. Good to meet you. General, thank you. Ms. McDonald. I'll start with General Kane. Is the United States being invaded by a foreign nation?
Sir, thanks for your question. I think at this point in time, I don't see any foreign state-sponsored folks invading, but I'll be mindful of the fact that there has been some border issues throughout time, and defer to DHS, who handles the border along the nation's contiguous outline.
Is there a rebellion somewhere in the United States?
Sir, I think there's definitely some frustrated folks out there.
I mean, if frustrated folks were a rebellion, and I guess that goes to my question for the Secretary. Two things. There should be some sort of paper flow that the committee, the Congress, the public can look at in invoking Title 10, Section 12406. So can you give us some clarification on whether the orders that were issued apply to specifically Los Angeles, to California generally, or is this a nationwide order?
The orders that have been issued, which are publicly available and known, relate to an ongoing situation in Los Angeles, which could expand to other places. But it's quite easy to point out that there has been an invasion of 21 million illegals in our country under the previous administration.
So
this administration was elected to get a hold of that.
Yeah, can we just
and
take
when you
turns?
have
Yeah.
ICE officers being attacked with concrete blocks,
Secretary,
they should be allowed to do their job.
Secretary, I'd really like to not try to create a viral moment for either of us. I'm actually trying to understand kind of the scope of this order. The order effectuates the ability to mobilize the Guard and the Marines. In the order, it does not specify a location. It does not specify which Marines or which Guard. And I'm trying to figure out, if you decided to do this collectively in Kansas or any other place, would you need to specify a new sort of fact pattern, or do you think this order applies to any guard, anywhere, any service branch, anywhere. It's just I get your justification. We disagree about the circumstances. I'm just trying to figure out, did you just potentially mobilize every guard everywhere and every service member everywhere? I mean, create the framework for that. I understand you didn't. I'm saying, what does the document do, in your opinion?
Senator, if you notice, the initial order of 2,000 in California was followed by a follow-on order for the additional 2,000, with a recognition that the situation there required more resources in order to support law enforcement. So part of it is getting ahead of a problem, so that if in other places, if there are other riots in places where law enforcement officers are threatened, we would have the capability to surge National Guard there if necessary. And thankfully, in most of those states, you'd have a governor that recognizes the need for it, supports it, and mobilizes it him or herself. In California, unfortunately, the governor wants to play politics with it.
I did step on the last part of your sentence, so I'm going to try to take turns here. Just on the 747 question, did the Department of Defense initiate the conversation with the Qataris? Did they initiate the conversation? How did that go?
Senator, I have to go back and review it, but we've been a part of the ongoing conversation.
Yeah, but I think it kind of matters who's asking, doesn't it?
Ultimately, the Defense Department is, or soon will be, when the memorandum of understanding is signed, in receipt of a gift from the Qatari government that could serve, once it's modified, eventually as something that the president could use.
I mean, I think this is illegal and unconstitutional, and I won't rant about that, but I actually think from the standpoint of our collective responsibilities, it very much matters what the paper flow was, who started these conversations. Did it come out of the White House? Did it come out of the Secretary of State or the President or the SecDef or at a lower level or ambassadors? Like, we're entitled to know, because we can agree or disagree about the propriety of this. But my basic request of you is that if we're going to disagree, let's disagree with the same set of facts. Let's have the documentation on the Qatari aircraft. Let's have the same set of documentation about what these orders do and don't do with respect to Los Angeles. Because if we're just going to scream past each other and then see who succeeds more on the internet, that's actually not the way to do this work. We're supposed to be in struggle against each other, but in a way where we actually have all the information. You have our information, we have yours, and so I'm hoping that we can get some documentation about both matters in a nonpartisan, bipartisan way. Thank you.
The Senate hearing segment revolving around Senator Schatz's questioning of General Kane and Secretary Hegseth provides a vivid case study in how the United States wrestles with the limits of executive authority, the role of Congress in oversight, and the delicate balance between national security and civil liberties. What emerges from this exchange is not only a clash of opinions about a specific set of military orders, but also a deeper reflection of enduring constitutional tensions. To understand the stakes, we need to examine three overlapping layers: the factual dispute about what the orders actually authorize, the legal and constitutional framework governing domestic military mobilization, and the political consequences of how these powers are framed and exercised. The first layer is the factual scope of the orders. Senator Schatz repeatedly asks whether the emergency orders were limited to Los Angeles and California, or whether they were drafted in such a way that they could apply nationwide. This is not a trivial distinction. If the order is geographically limited, then it is a localized emergency response requiring new authorizations for other jurisdictions. But if the order is written broadly, it functions as a standing authority that could be used to mobilize the Guard or Marines anywhere in the country. Schatz zeroes in on this ambiguity, asking whether Secretary Hegseth has, in effect, potentially mobilized every Guard everywhere. Hegseth's answers attempt to reassure while preserving discretion. He emphasizes that the initial order covered 2,000 personnel in California, followed by a supplemental 2,000, but also admits that part of the purpose was to be prepared for unrest in other states. That elasticity, simultaneously narrow in description but open-ended in interpretation, is exactly what Schatz finds alarming. This brings us to the second layer, the legal and constitutional framework. U.S. law places sharp limits on the use of the military in domestic affairs. The Posse Comitatus Act prohibits federal troops from performing law enforcement functions unless explicitly authorized by Congress. The Insurrection Act provides an exception, allowing the president to deploy federal forces domestically under certain conditions, such as rebellion or obstruction of federal law. The National Guard straddles these categories. Under state control, Title 32, it can support law enforcement when governors request it, but once federalized under Title 10, it comes under presidential command and is bound by posse comitatus restrictions. This patchwork reflects America's deep wariness of domestic militarization. Schatz's questioning reflects this legal context. If there is no foreign invasion and no organized rebellion, both of which General Kane denied, then what legal basis justifies a broad, potentially nationwide mobilization? Hegseth's reliance on flexible language about getting ahead of problems may make operational sense, but it sits uncomfortably with the legal framework designed to restrict such actions. The third layer is political and rhetorical. Notice the stark difference in language between General Kane and Secretary Hegseth. Kane, the career officer, is careful. He sees no foreign invasion, no rebellion, only frustrated folks and long-standing border issues. Hegseth, the civilian political leader, escalates the language, describing an invasion of 21 million migrants under the previous administration and pointing to attacks on ICE officers with concrete blocks. This rhetorical escalation serves a purpose. By framing immigration as an invasion, Hegseth implicitly justifies the use of extraordinary military measures. Schatz avoids that rhetorical trap. He does not contest the language in the moment. Instead, he pivots back to documentation. What do the orders literally say? What is their scope? And who authorized foreign involvement with Qatar regarding the 747 aircraft? Schatz's approach highlights a core democratic principle. Policy disagreements are inevitable, but factual clarity is non-negotiable. Without shared facts, without the paper trail, oversight collapses, and executive discretion expands unchecked. The mention of Qatar adds another wrinkle. Schatz presses Hegseth on whether the Department of Defense initiated conversations with Qatar and how those conversations unfolded. Hegseth's vague responses, "I have to review," "we've been a part of the conversation," raise more questions than they answer. Foreign involvement in domestic military logistics, even if limited to aircraft provision, triggers legitimate concerns about sovereignty and transparency. Who initiated the conversation? Was it the president, the State Department, or lower-level officials? Each pathway has different implications for accountability. Schatz's demand is straightforward. Disclose the paper flow so Congress can evaluate propriety. In his words, we can agree or disagree about propriety, but we cannot disagree about facts. That insistence embodies Congress's oversight role in a democratic system. Supporters of the administration argue that Schatz's concerns, while constitutionally valid, risk hampering effective governance. From their perspective, Los Angeles was experiencing escalating unrest, including attacks on federal officers. In such a volatile situation, the government must have the ability to surge resources quickly, without waiting for new paperwork each time unrest flares in a new location. The broad language of the order, in this view, is not about executive overreach, but about operational prudence. Furthermore, governors generally control their own National Guard units, so federal orders usually supplement rather than override state authority. Supporters argue that the legal authorities, Title 10, Title 32, the Insurrection Act, are already in place, and the orders simply activated them in anticipation of possible spread. For them, flexibility is essential to readiness. Critics, however, see the same flexibility as dangerous ambiguity. A broad, open-ended order may not be abused in this case, but it sets a precedent that future administrations could exploit to justify deployments in contexts far removed from genuine emergencies. Imagine a scenario where protests against federal policy are framed as threats to enforcement and met with military mobilization. The risk is not only theoretical. History shows how easily domestic military force can be turned against political dissent. Critics also highlight the opacity around Qatar. If foreign partners are engaged in discussions about domestic mobilization, Congress and the public deserve to know exactly how and why. Without transparency, executive discretion shades into unilateralism. Historical context reinforces these concerns. During the Civil Rights era, federal troops were deployed to enforce desegregation orders, raising questions of federal authority versus state sovereignty. After 9/11, debates raged about the role of the military in domestic counterterrorism. In 2020, the possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act during protests generated intense controversy. In each case, the key issue was the same. Under what conditions can the military be deployed domestically, and who decides? This hearing is the latest chapter in that ongoing story. Schatz's line of questioning echoes past congressional insistence on transparency, while Hegset's emphasis on discretion echoes the executive branch's recurring plea for flexibility. The stakes are high. If broad, ambiguous orders become normalized, the line between law enforcement and military action blurs, eroding public trust and civil liberties. If Congress overcorrects, paralyzing executive action with rigid constraints, genuine crises could spiral out of control. The balance is delicate. One possible way forward is legislative reform that requires all domestic mobilization orders to specify geographic scope, include time limits, and be reported to Congress promptly. Such reforms would preserve executive flexibility while ensuring accountability. Similarly, protocols should mandate immediate congressional notification of any foreign involvement in domestic operations. These measures would not eliminate friction between the branches, but they would channel it into structured, transparent processes.
At its core, the hearing dramatizes the ongoing struggle between security and liberty, discretion and oversight, rhetoric and documentation. Hegset's framing of immigration as invasion justifies extraordinary measures but risks inflaming politics and eroding legal boundaries. Schatz's insistence on paper flow may seem pedantic, but it is essential for maintaining constitutional balance. General Kane's careful avoidance of exaggerated language reminds us that the military itself often understands the dangers of politicized framing. The conversation about Qatar reminds us that foreign entanglements, however minor, magnify the need for transparency. In the end, what Schatz demands is not agreement on policy, but agreement on facts. That principle, that disagreements must be grounded in shared documentation, is the lifeblood of democratic oversight. Far from being a weakness, the messy struggle on display in this hearing is democracy working as intended. Congress presses for clarity, the executive defends discretion, the military provides its professional assessment. The tension is real, sometimes frustrating, but necessary. The true danger lies not in disagreement, but in opacity. If the executive holds back documents, if Congress cannot establish the factual basis of decisions, if rhetoric substitutes for records, then the balance tips toward unchecked power. That is why this hearing matters, and why its lessons extend far beyond Los Angeles. It is about the architecture of American governance itself, and whether, in moments of crisis, the system bends toward accountability or toward unilateralism. Thanks for sticking with that deep dive. If you found the breakdown useful, hit like and subscribe. It helps get this kind of nonpartisan, context-rich coverage out to more people. Drop which side you're on in the poll, surge readiness or stronger congressional guardrails, and why. If enough of you want it, we'll get a legal expert on for a follow-up episode to parse the statutory authorities line by line. See you next time, where we keep pressing for clarity, not theatrics.